The exhumation was an unpleasant but necessary procedure to solve the case. Police surrounded the burial site at a cemetery in Texas. A small excavator carefully began its work, removing the layers of soil one by one. Suddenly, everyone froze, exchanging tense glances. The excavator had reached the spot where the coffin was supposed to be, and the investigators could not believe their eyes. What they saw could undermine all their work in the investigation that had lasted nearly 4 decades. On December 1st, 1981, at around 6 in the evening, 45-year-old Charles Freeman came home from work and was surprised that his wife Virginia was not there. Charles and Virginia were supposed to have dinner with friends, and she would certainly have called if she had been delayed at work or on her way home. Concerned, Charles phoned their friends to let them know they would be late. Then he called his wife's colleagues. 40-year-old Virginia Freeman, known as Ginger, worked as a real estate agent. Her colleagues told Charles that Virginia had received a call earlier that day from a new client interested in buying property. In the afternoon, she drove out to show him a potential listing, and after that, she neither returned nor contacted the office. Worried, Charles asked the neighbors to look after his 2 children, 11-year-old Brad and 14-year-old Betsy. Then he got the address of the house that Virginia had planned to show a potential buyer from her colleagues and headed there. A neighbor and family friend, Ken, offered to accompany him. The house was located in a remote rural part of the county. When they arrived, the men immediately noticed Virginia's car parked in the driveway. The lights in the house were off and the door was locked. As they walked around the property, they nearly stumbled upon something. On the ground, they found a massive pool of blood, Virginia's blood. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. There was no doubt she was dead. Charles immediately contacted the police in College Station, Texas. The police who arrived at the scene were immediately concerned about preserving the evidence, so they sent Charles and Ken back home, promising to speak with Charles later that night. The crime scene looked truly horrific, an image that would haunt detectives for a long time. There was so much blood because Virginia had been stabbed repeatedly in the neck. Next to her body lay a large stone smeared with blood. It was clear the killer had brutally bludgeoned her with it. The upper half of Virginia's clothing had been pulled upward, and from the waist down she was nearly naked, wearing only a pair of pantyhose clinging to one leg. The victim's state of undress suggested she may have been sexually assaulted. Her hands bore defensive wounds, evidence that she had fought her attacker. At that time, police couldn't rely on DNA, but they could identify blood type, so investigators needed to examine Virginia's fingernails for traces of her killer's skin. Tire tracks showed the killer's car had been parked in front of Virginia's vehicle. It appeared that they had arrived at the house together, but halfway down the path, the attacker struck. The closer to the spot where her body was found, the more frequent the blood drops and nail marks became. It was clear Virginia had suffered greatly before she died. Near her body, police also found 12 cigarette butts, indicating the killer smoked. Of course, in 1981, that hardly narrowed down the suspect pool. No weapon besides the stone was found at the scene. Robbery could be ruled out since Virginia still wore her watch and rings, and her purse was left in the car. It was time to speak with the victim's husband. Despite the horrific night he had endured, Charles tried to remain composed and answered all of the investigators' questions. He recounted how he had found his wife's body. Earlier that day, he had been at work, a fact confirmed by his colleagues. Charles was respected in the community, and he clearly had no motive to kill his wife. There was nothing for him to gain from her death. Their marriage showed no signs of trouble. Divorce was not on the horizon, and he would not receive an insurance payout. Charles worked as an engineer and earned a good living on his own. Charles and Virginia's friends, who affectionately called her Ginger, were devastated by her murder. She had never been in conflict with anyone. On the contrary, she was always ready to help others, even complete strangers. Virginia taught Sunday school, volunteered with the Red Cross, and chaired a program designed to help international students at Texas A&M University adapt to life in the U.S. But above all else, family was her priority. She and her husband loved spending time outdoors with their children, hiking, boating, camping. Virginia was a vibrant, joyful, deeply religious woman, admired not only for her beauty, but also for her infectious laughter that could brighten any room. She lived to be of service to others, was an active member of her community, and it was hard to fathom that anyone would want to end her life in such a brutal way. On the other hand, investigators began to wonder if the killer hadn't been specifically targeting Ginger at all. Detectives went to the real estate office where she worked and learned something important. When a new client called the agency, the secretary would forward the call to whichever realtor was next in line. That very day, a man with a southern accent had called, saying he was interested in purchasing property. The call was passed to Virginia, and the conversation seemed to put her in a good mood. She told her colleagues that this new potential client had recently sold a house for $72,000 and wanted to reinvest the money into buying a property in the area. For Virginia, this could have meant a very profitable deal. She went to meet him in person, but her colleagues didn't know the man's name or phone number. This meant that the so-called client, who was almost certainly the killer, hadn't set out to murder Virginia Freeman specifically. Since nearly all the agents in the office were women, the victim could have been any one of them. Virginia had become a random target, which made the search for her killer even more difficult. The testimony of Virginia's colleagues further convinced police of Charles's innocence. Her husband would not have called the agency, faking a southern accent. Moreover, there was no way he could have known that his wife would be next in line to take the call and be lured to a remote house, assaulted, and murdered. It became clear that there was no prior connection between the victim and the killer. The choice of Virginia was entirely random. Yet the brutality and efficiency of the crime led investigators to suspect that it had been committed by a serial killer who happened to be passing through the area. Meanwhile, the medical examiner performed the autopsy and counted 11 stab wounds on the left side of the victim's neck. In addition to this, she had been severely beaten with a rock and finally strangled with such force that her hyoid bone was broken. However, the surprise for investigators was that, despite the condition of her clothing, there had been no sexual assault. Given that the city of College Station had virtually no crime, residents were shocked. Among real estate agents, panic set in. Some agencies required clients to come to the office before an agent would take them on. Others demanded that clients leave a driver's license at the office and travel to the property in the realtor's car. And many female employees began carrying pepper spray. A little later, realtors started working in pairs and asked clients to provide identification. The city's Home Builders and Realtors Association joined forces to offer a reward of $10,000 for information about the perpetrator, which at the time was a very large sum. Witnesses did come forward to the police, and they were able to significantly assist the investigation. First of all, there was a female school bus driver. She had seen a man sitting in a car near the house where Ginger was murdered. He was clearly waiting for something or someone. The driver did not recognize the man. He was not a parent of any of the students. Another witness, a stonemason, also contacted the police. He reported that he had driven past the crime scene around the time of the murder. He said he saw a car but could not recall the details. In an attempt to help jog his memory, he was placed under hypnosis. Under hypnosis, the witness recalled stopping at a stop sign and seeing a car parked in front of Virginia's vehicle. It was a dirty white Mustang. The driver had his arm hanging out the window with long hair and glasses. When the hypnotist asked him to describe the car more closely, the witness provided a partial license plate number. Both witnesses also helped create 2 composite sketches, which the police shared with the media. Despite a number of calls from townspeople who believed they had recognized the suspect, none of the leads resulted in a breakthrough in the case. Investigators remained at a dead end until June 1983, when convicted killer Henry Lee Lucas made a shocking statement as he left the courthouse. He admitted to killing 100 women in Texas alone. When the detectives working on Virginia's case dug deeper, they noticed frightening similarities between his crimes and Ginger's murder. Henry Lee Lucas preferred to stab and strangle his victims. 2 years earlier, at the time of Ginger's death, he had been in Texas and could have been in College Station. The detectives did not waste time and questioned Henry. When shown a photograph of Ginger, he claimed to remember stabbing her in the neck. Since this matched the manner in which Virginia had been killed, the investigators decided to take the suspect to the crime scene to confirm whether he was telling the truth. Henry was supposed to direct the driver of the car to the house near which he had killed Virginia. The detectives neither prompted him nor gave any hints, chatting casually to avoid revealing that they were close to the location. They drove past the house where the crime occurred, and Henry did not even twitch an eyebrow. It became clear that he had deceived them, but he had a reasonable motive. In Texas, executions are not delayed for long, so he hoped that as long as law enforcement needed him, his sentence execution would be postponed. Henry was eliminated from the list of suspects, and unfortunately, the police had no other leads. Years passed, the media had long stopped mentioning the case, and the detectives didn't know what else they could have done. Charles remarried and moved away, wanting to start over, far from all the painful memories. However, 16 years after the brutal murders of the realtor, law enforcement gained access to DNA technology. In April 1997, the detectives sent the evidence to a laboratory and achieved the first real breakthrough in the case. DNA from the killer, with whom the victim had struggled before her death, was found under her fingernails. The case was officially reopened, and the police began working with renewed determination. In particular, they focused on the partial license plate number that the Mason had provided under hypnosis. Over the years, vehicle registration databases had become far more comprehensive than what was available to the police 16 years earlier. Detectives were able to narrow the list of possible car owners down to two. One possibility was immediately ruled out, while the other looked promising. The car belonged to a former military serviceman who had been stationed at Fort Hood, about an hour from College Station. However, after retiring, he lived in Kentucky. The detectives traveled to Kentucky and collected his DNA. It did not match. It was another false lead. But the investigators did not lose hope. Now, with the ability to quickly and definitively eliminate suspects, they were empowered. They expanded their search, reviewing dozens of murder cases across Texas, hoping to exclude criminals who had been caught over the past 40 years. In particular, their attention was drawn to convicted criminal James Otto Earhart. He had been sentenced to death and had spent the past 9 years awaiting execution. Before his conviction, 44-year-old James lived with his mother in Bryan, Texas, and earned a living by repairing and reselling electrical appliances. 6 years after Virginia's murder, he was convicted of killing a 9-year-old girl less than 8 miles from the house where Virginia had been murdered. At the time, he was not considered a suspect because it was unusual for a killer to first attack an adult woman and then a child. Moreover, there was no way to test his DNA. Now, that possibility existed, but the police were denied the request because there was not enough evidence to justify it. The investigators needed more than mere suspicion that James had committed the murder. Lacking stronger evidence, detectives had to turn their attention to other work. Fortunately, technology continued to advance, and in Virginia, the Parabon Nanolabs laboratory emerged, capable of reconstructing a criminal's appearance by analyzing their DNA. They create a composite sketch using specific traits determined from an individual's DNA. The police sent a sample of the suspect's DNA to the lab, and the results did not disappoint. In April 2017, they held a press conference to share the suspect's composite sketch. Investigators immediately noticed that the sketch resembled someone they had already encountered during the investigation. They then leveraged the new world of DNA databases, which allow researchers to trace family trees. Using open-source research, they created a list of potential suspects, and one of the names on that list was James Earhart. The investigators wanted to speak with the man, but an insurmountable obstacle arose. James Earhart had already been executed in 1999. The only way to definitively confirm that James was responsible for Virginia's murder was through exhumation. However, the police still lacked sufficient grounds for this. The judge stated that the only way to authorize an exhumation was to obtain a DNA sample from a close relative of the killer, and only with their full consent. The suspect had a son living in Texas. The detectives reached out to him. Initially, he did not want to have anything to do with the case, likely not wanting to be associated with his father. But the detectives persuaded him, and he provided a DNA sample. The very next morning, the lab results came back, a 50% match with Ginger's killer's DNA. This was the evidence the police and prosecutor needed as grounds for exhumation. On June 27, 2018, 37 years after Virginia's murder, investigators arrived at the cemetery where their suspect was buried. A small excavator carefully dug through the soil, cautiously approaching the coffin. But when it reached James Earhart's remains, the investigators exchanged stunned glances. They could hardly believe it. Where there should have been a traditional coffin, there was only a simple cardboard box. Cardboard, essentially made of plant fibers, decomposes very quickly in the ground, which accelerated the decomposition of the body. 19 years after the execution, only bones remained. The detectives felt disheartened. They knew that at this stage of decomposition, obtaining DNA could be extremely difficult. Miraculously, they succeeded. A sample was sent for comparison. James Earhart's DNA matched the DNA found under Virginia Freeman's fingernails. The case was finally solved nearly 40 years later. The police believe that James did not know Ginger personally and simply called the real estate agency, knowing that mostly women worked there. He told Virginia he was interested in a property in a quiet, remote location so that they would be completely alone and no one would interfere with his plan. He likely intended to assault her, but she resisted so fiercely that he realized he could not succeed, and he took her life. Next, he decided to target a 9-year-old girl. On May 12, 1987, a warm, sunny Tuesday, 9-year-old Candy Janelle Kirtland got off the school bus and headed toward her home. Candy lived in Bryan with her father, John, and stepmother, Ruth Ann. The bus stopped at 3:40 p.m., just a few steps from her front door. A neighbor mowing the lawn saw the girl and waved politely. When Candy entered the house, her father was at work, and her stepmother had taken Candy's brother to the eye doctor. Her parents returned around 4 p.m. and found her textbooks on the doorstep and her keys inside, but Candy herself was nowhere to be found. After contacting all her acquaintances and even her mother in Houston, the family reached out to the police. At least 5 neighbors reported seeing a large man, about 40 years old, earlier that day, about 2 hours before Candy got off the bus. He was described as a large, unkempt man with an unpleasant odor. After a composite sketch was created, several more witnesses identified him. Interestingly, he had visited the Kirtlands' home a week earlier to discuss buying a paint sprayer that Candy's parents were selling. At that time, Candy's stepmother noticed that the man kept staring at her stepdaughter. On May 12th, he returned to the same street and asked neighbors how to contact the Kirtlands. He drove a late-model sedan, which was seen at the family's house when Candy got off the bus. A neighbor recalled Candy speaking to the heavy-set man in the sedan parked in the driveway. The perpetrator did not even attempt to be discreet and drew attention from neighbors. He also lived in the same city as his victim. When the police arrived at his house, where he lived with his mother, he was gone. However, during a search, they found the Kirtlands' address and 3 newspaper clippings about the girl's disappearance. He was arrested a week later in the woods, sleeping in a new car. During interrogation, James denied killing the girl, but admitted that she had gotten into his car on May 12th. He claimed he drove her to a nearby intersection and let her out, and when he heard about her disappearance, he panicked, fearing he would be blamed. He changed cars and fled. On the same day, May 26th, the police found the child's body by the road in a wooded area. A local resident, out for a walk, noticed a terrible smell. Following it, he discovered a pile of garbage, under which a white sneaker was visible, and called the police. The body belonged to little Candy. Her hands were tied behind her back with an electrical cord, and she had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber Remington. She was wearing the same clothes as the day she disappeared and had died the same day. The gun matching the crime was found in James's car, with 1 cartridge missing. On May 12th, he had deliberately returned to the family's house because he had taken a liking to the girl a week earlier. That morning, he responded to an ad about finding a kitten, claiming he wanted a pet for his daughter, though he had no daughter. He likely used the kitten to lure Candy. At trial, the prosecutor described her as an easy target. In her room, her diary revealed that she was sad because she had few friends. The kidnapper and murderer chose a quiet, lonely, and friendly girl who loved animals as his victim. The psychiatrist who examined the man stated that he had borderline personality disorder. Therefore, there is a high likelihood that he did not limit himself to just 2 crimes, and may have killed outside of Texas as well. He spent a lot of time in Colorado and even told his cousin that he had killed a girl there. In a conversation with a cousin, he once mentioned that he enjoyed hunting there, but he was not talking about animals. This suggests that there may be unsolved murders in Colorado for which James Otto Earhart could be responsible. There is also a 3rd murder in Texas that investigators believe James Earhart committed. They have no DNA evidence to confirm it, but since his arrest in connection with Candy's murder, Bryan police considered him the prime suspect. This case involves 51-year-old Ruth Richardson Green, murdered in 1986, also in Bryan. That February, the woman suddenly disappeared after her daytime shift at a bakery. Her car remained in the parking lot, and all her belongings were in place. Her nearly nude body was later found in the woods by fishermen who were alerted by vultures. She had been shot in the head and stabbed multiple times. The pathologist believes she was alive for almost the entire week she was considered missing. Sound familiar? She was kidnapped, killed, and disposed of in the woods just like Candy. When Earhart was arrested after Candy's murder, he had been sleeping in a car only 50 meters from the location where Ruth's body had been found the year before. He lived near her workplace, and police found newspaper clippings about Ruth's murder at his home. However, this alone does not prove anything, as officers also discovered clippings about other solved crimes attributed to other killers. Male semen was found on Ruth's body, but it is now too degraded for modern DNA analysis. Convicted James Earhart refused to speak about Ruth, even knowing he would be executed. He likely hoped for a successful appeal until the very end. The killer was executed on August 11, 1999. One may wonder why James's DNA was not in the FBI's CODIS, combined DNA index system database, even though he had spent 11 years in prison awaiting execution. Why wasn't a sample taken? Because he refused. Today, DNA samples of convicted criminals are taken without consent. But back then, the child murderer simply said no, and the authorities left him alone. Thus, the killer of Virginia Freeman was finally identified. As the saying goes, better late than never. But it is still somewhat frustrating that investigators had almost caught him nearly 2 decades earlier. 20 years ago, detectives cast a wide net, analyzing similar crimes and the possible involvement of convicted offenders in Texas. As early as November 2001, police and prosecutors discussed obtaining DNA from convicted serial killer James Earhart to determine whether he had killed Virginia. At that time, they already considered him a serial killer responsible for Ruth's murder, a fact that had not yet been proven, and were interested in him as a suspect in Ginger's case. However, lacking evidence in Ruth's case, he was officially only guilty of the girl's murder, not that of an adult woman, and the district attorney saw no grounds to exhume his body. Had they acted then, the case could have been solved in 2001. Unfortunately, Charles Freeman passed away several years before the case was definitively closed. Yet at least his and Virginia's children, now adults Brad and Betsy, learned the truth. While it cannot bring their mother back, they can be certain that the person responsible for such a horrific crime is no longer free.